before, I think the thing is that you're setting up a very clear distinction with the type of computer activity which you seem to be very derogatory about, when actually there's some very interesting applications of technology through programming, which is precisely programmers drawing, programming code.
Well, appreciation.
But then precisely, I'm not going to attack.
Right.
You're taking a
attack
position.
me,
You take a position which is so myopic in terms of what type of
it's not going to attack me, right?
But I'm just curious about, photography, digital, I don't mean to hold it up, but photography transformed drawing, transformed painting.
Right.
How do you feel about lens-based technology then? Because I'm sure some of those drawings to me looked as though they used lenses with a view to then inform drawing, as opposed to someone in a rain sitting out there doing it. So there's an intervention somewhere.
If there was a hierarchy of how I felt about hand drawing in comparison to computer engineering, working solely on computer, I would say that there would be an intermediary stage, which would be a computer generated image partly that conveys in some kind of way the personality of the architect, much like that one does. So that doesn't necessarily I wouldn't be so myopic that I would say that doesn't have any merit or any worth. It conveys the personality of the artist and of the architect. It exists for me, not in the same way as a completely hand drawing would do, because I would understand the kind of craft and the process that went into that. But that for me has more merit because it expresses the personality of the architect and the artist and something which is not completely together computer based.
Skill versus skill. And if you're drawing with a computer, you get highly skilled in using the computer. And I'm not saying that's not drawing, but that's the skill from that. And that can be terribly creative as well. But there's also a handmade skill as well. So I think it's really about gaining expertise in a way that's right for the project and right for yourself.
But for me, what's not this the kind of work you're showing is problematic in and of itself. It's the idea of this over-reliance on a single method of production. And I actually think that's highly problematic because I think what we try to teach students is a kind of fluency using a vast range of techniques such that they gain an understanding of how different techniques might facilitate a certain kind of spatial exploration and other techniques might preclude. So that for me is what's a bit problematic about committing to a single kind of design that's a sort of idealized perspective.
I don't ask my students to draw with me at all. Again, it's not about, it's about thinking. Again, it's using my experience of working with students. I mean, SketchUp, that's the tool, the digital SketchUp. I mean, a student can actually come in and within a day and a half of thinking produce a series of three-dimensional images, all coloured and zooty, and there's no thought process applied to it. And some of the students who come from overseas can using the expertise they've gained in doing their degree, whatever it is, can design you a 500-bedroom hotel with fire escapes and everything overnight. There's no architectural intent behind it, there's no kind of concept behind it, there's no greater sense of architecture behind it. Nevertheless, there it is. It's worked out, it's computer generated, and it looks believable, and the images always look like a photograph. There's no thought behind it.
I have a question. It can take us 2 weeks or probably more to make a drawing, and once you've made it, it's out there, it's a beautiful object. But how do you apply that, for example, in the profession when you've got projects on site and you need to turn drawings over quickly?
That's a different thing altogether. I mean, I'm not a Luddite. My office studio uses computers for construction drawings and production information. But it's not all hand work as far as sending out information practice concerned. Architectural practice could not exist without the computer for that purpose. I'm talking about designing, not production information. Does that answer you?
Yeah, absolutely. Does the audience have any questions based on what you've seen?
Well, if you've got a tablet app or like programs which you can draw, but then you convert them
to do that.
I think it's about a definition of how you see a drawing. Does it have to have your hand on it? And I'm a member of this thing called the Drawing Research Network, and there's loads of comments about whether computers can produce drawings. That is something akin to hand drawing with the skill behind it. But I quite see those kind of drawings where you're manipulating with your hands. Actually quite like etchings, because when you make etchings, you make one drawing but it's converted, if you like. So there's a real thin line, you know, between what drawing is and how you know, it's very amorphous. So,
That's good.
Thanks very much. I think we have to move on to our second panelist now. So, Chris, Steve, please.
I'm the devil. I've got the computer. I'm not an artist. I have to say that every time because I just don't. I trained in fine arts, but left at Brighton and couldn't really find a medium, traditional medium, with which to draw. So I use code. I use software code, and code is much misunderstood. It's much misaligned, and I think computers are generally misunderstood. There are applications, there's hardware, and there's code. And code is very interesting. It's a very interesting medium, which unfortunately in the UK system isn't really taught particularly well in architectural art schools per se. I mean, that's a huge generalisation, but I'm putting it out there. But I'm very interested in code because code offers a quite interesting intervention between representation, material forms of representation, and immaterial forms of which have little representation. And I'm curious about when we talk about drawing, to what extent we want to include representation as being a primary subject, or whether actually things such as code, because I draw in code, there's no doubt it's a cognitive, it's some skill adept to it. I'm losing the skills, but it's something for sure that is a reflexive cognitive process. However, what it manifests isn't necessarily representational. In fact, many of the people who navigate the city, if you think about it, aren't always using representational devices. They never were. Many people are asking people, hey, how do you get to somewhere? Now, the question of representation in those conversations, those navigations, and in the end, concepts or ideas of the city and architecture of this building we have to work here, is constituted on many, many non-representational modes and interventions, as much as they are the photographs, the classic forms of representation of which we see many around us. So I'll put that out there because it's code in which I'm operating. This was just a reflection on a small second year project we ran this year, which will run again, well, until it gets tired. And what we do is draw with satellites. We get and it's, I don't know how I'm going to do this because it's a long tableau really. But these guys are examples in the past of people adopting a GPS-equipped piece of equipment. It might be an iPhone, it might be an Android, or it might be just a sat-nav which orienteers, geographers use. But nevertheless, they're in the landscape. And we invited over Esther Pollock. And Esther Pollock, to some extent, is an artist, a fine artist who uses GPS as her platform for drawing. So you can, and these are works from previous years where students have begun to use their bodies to reconcile the gap between the satellites and the feet and the ground. So there's no hands involved in this per se, but there's some decision making. This is Esther's work in particular, where she begins to work with people. She's been working with folk in Africa at the moment to look at how they move through space and how they move around their various villages and go about their daily lives. But she's been asked them to carry GPS devices. And then what she does is a very interesting model. It's because they don't use maps to get from one place to the other, as many of you don't. So what she does is then she asks a robot to replay the drawing in front of them, and they discuss it, and they're quite happy. Actually, I was quite surprised that they're happy with the Cartesian projection, but they're quite happy to discuss it. So in many ways, there's a moment that Esther talks about in which code supports a conversation, and then it becomes represented. So we set up a simple task for our students, really to simply begin drawing with satellites. And this is more Esther's work. You can see her beginning to make passages and the robots moving across a car park there, drawing according to certain parameters. And these are probably ghosts of other people who've been there. So the robot potters around, following other people's traces. So you begin to get this idea that the motion and the activity of the robot is as much about the process of redrawing and re-representing. And in many ways we get this sand that then gets blown away in the wind. So what we did in February last year was to ask Isala, how many were you? We were probably 130 students, ridiculous amount, to basically work in small groups of 5 or 6. And we gave them a GPS device and we asked them to draw the city. Nothing more than that, but we asked them to use their body. So this is Edinburgh. There's a couple of students here who drew this one. And I just picked 5 drawings just to step through time. Esther set up some interesting problems. What is a spiral? What might a spiral be? And these particular students, there's no answer. Well, they just use that as a brief at the starting point. And here in this part of the city, these particular students started their drawing at 0 years at Lauriston Hospital. And then at 5 to 11 years, they move over to George Heriot School. Then they move to St Thomas of Aquinas, Roman Catholic High School. Then they moved over to ECA, which I think is down there. Then they moved to the McEwen Hall at 22. Got a job in Sainsbury's. Got over to, they worked for solicitors, I think. Over here, but eventually they moved to a graveyard where they died. Well, they were buried too. So it was a drawing. Now again, taking a line for a walk, as Paul Clement said, was implicit in all of these. We go to the next one. Now, when I reflect on it in the book, it's very interesting to start understanding what it does for conceptions of space-time and models of representation. This particular group simply walked the Royal Mile until it finished, and they timed it to the second. They then chose to split up and walk that same walk for exactly the same amount of time across the city in 3 different directions. So what you begin to unpack is, if you unhinge yourself from perhaps the mannerism and the processes which are associated with traditional forms of representation, and allow other instruments to begin to start asking you questions about what they might afford as a drawing process, you begin to get different questions about representation. These are all the same amount of time, but they allow us to unpick aspects of the city in different ways. Next one, please. Other ideas, these guys are quite obsessive actually. They were determined to walk straight lines. So you're looking at perfectly straight lines. It's just that buildings got in the way. So they set out and said, we're going to walk 2 straight lines. That's probably from there to there. And as far as you talked about them, the code was the decision-making process. We're going to walk a straight line. And the fact that the architecture gets in the way is something that Tim Ingold talks about when he talks about lines. That lines, all lines, are situated in a social cultural network. That they're all negotiated. Every line here has a relationship with me as much as the person who drew it. You can't separate yourself out from a network in which you're having a representation that is for other people. So in some ways I'm quite interested in these because these are straight lines. But the buildings became social, architectural, urban, geographical tensions between them. This is another property to affording a different way of using lines was code itself. I'll have to read this because this gets going. This is called reverse code, and the students literally understood how they went to work by turning. I go out of my front door, turn left, and I turn right, and I turn left, 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 right. Well, they simply reversed that and see where they ended up. So they didn't end up at their houses, they didn't end up at work. What they ended up was complete strangers' houses. So you begin to understand that code is something we can start just playing around with. We can shop it, we can begin to hack it. So I don't know whether it makes sense or not, but I find this particular stuff, how you deal with code in drawing, or do you just code it with an idea of what you want the drawing to look like, and then you assess it with another code that says, that's a good drawing, well that's not, try again. And I'm uncomfortable with that because that sets up quite firm criteria for what is good drawing and bad drawing. Last one, I think. This one is called the explosion. And this is another rule-based one. The rule-based was team members developed a simple rule. See how far away you can get from the same spot in Edinburgh in the same amount of time using different modes of transport. These guys started in a car and they got from George Square, I think, all the way to the Falkirk roundabout. These jumped on a bus but had to wait an enormous amount of time to get down to Leith Walk, and these simply walked down to the Botanics. So again, what for me, these incredibly simple 3 lines, what they afford is a very different approach to how we think about the code, the decision making which technology can disassociate from heavily loaded modes of representation which bring it criteria to say this is good or bad.